Thank you so much. Can you hear me this way, or should I use this one? It's okay? Okay. The one who can't hear what I'm talking about doesn't know what to answer, so that's the problem. Officers, midshipmen and women, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a great honor to be here. I saw honor plastered outside here, and I originally learned British English, so I always feel that real honor should be with a U, but it's okay. I'm learning the American honor, and it is indeed. And thanks to Ed, and thanks to everyone who convenes this great conference. It is not least an honor because of the people who are here and the quality of the other speakers. It made me think of a good story about a man who has received as a gift a ticket for the finals of the World Cup in soccer. And for those of you outside the US, you know that that's the biggest you can get. And he's right in the main stand, so he gets in there, he sits down. He's so proud, he's so grateful. The game starts, and the seat next to him is free. And he's wondering, can that be true? Is someone not using their seat for the World Cup final? So he asks the guy next to that seat and asks, is it true? It's a free seat? And he says, well, that ticket belonged to my wife, and she sadly passed away recently. It's the first time I'm out without her. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. My condolences. But didn't anyone else want the ticket? I mean, neighbors, family, friends? No, they're all at the funeral. I'm hoping none of you now think that you should be somewhere else. But it feels a bit like that, being able to speak to all of you. A great honor indeed. Moral philosophy is a strange subject. It is meant to help us find the right course of action, not least the right reasons for that course of action. Yet many feel that they are more confused when they engage in philosophical argument than they were before they started. Indeed, that is often our aim as teachers, isn't it? To encourage reflection and the admission of doubt and ambivalence, and thus indeed to make things harder than they seem. I like so much the old story of the man who comes to the post office with a letter, and the person working there says, this letter is too heavy, you need another stamp. And he says, oh, will that make it lighter? And it won't. Adding that extra stamp will just make it slightly heavier, but maybe also easier to transport. So what then is moral philosophy good for? Well, in the case of virtue ethics, one of the core topics of this conference, so well treated yesterday, the most obvious answer is the following. A philosophical exposition of moral virtues helps us, in spite of all the complexities and particularities of each individual context, to identify who we want to be, not only as individuals, but also as members of the same community or praxis. Hence, delineating virtues and instilling them in training and everyday conversation does not solve everything, but it gives us a framework for connecting the dots between theory and practice, between ideals and actual motivation, and between individual and community. Now, when analyzing a pursuit which at its core can be extreme, violent, and filled with fear, it would seem that courage, rather than moderation, is the foremost virtue to pursue. And the discourse on military courage is indeed long and rich, partially with roots both in Greek, not least Homeric poetry, and in Plato's dialogues, most famously the Laches. It feels a bit strange having people like Nancy Sherman in the room and speaking about these things, but I'll try to be as accurate as I can. But there is more to it than courage, as Plato himself intimated when he hinted in the first book of the Laws, through the Athenian stranger, that courage is the lowest of the virtues when it comes to maintaining the good city and erecting good laws. One answer to that, of course, could be the unity of the virtues, that the one virtue is dependent on the other. But at least we should explore the others. There are clearly other virtues of great relevance to military pursuits. For instance, as my good colleague Greg Reichberg at Prio has pointed out, he says hi to a number of you here, Thomas Aquinas develops a rich and often overlooked discourse on military prudence, a branch of the virtue of prudence which addresses the kind of wisdom and reflection needed for the proper use of armed force. I can warmly recommend his book on Thomas Aquinas and the ethics of war on Cambridge University Press. Today, however, as indicated, I will concentrate on a virtue arguably implicit in both Plato's treatment of courage and Aquinas' treatment of prudence, namely moderation or temperance. I will briefly suggest three interpretations of what moderation might be, and then ask about their relevance to the military setting. also trying to address the thorny issue of moral injury or damage, which is today's theme. As Brent pointed out, there might be something slightly paradoxical about addressing moderation while we are all eating this hearty and plentiful meal. But it is Lent, so I guess adding some touches of temperance, even if only in words, is fitting. So for those of you who have any bad conscience today, I'm filling up the Lenten quota. Of course, I will only be able in the next 24 minutes to touch the surface. I heard a funny story about a man who comes home to his wife and says, I have good news and bad news. And she says, I'm really stressed out. I have so much to do. I only want the good news. And he says, okay, the airbags in the car work. You realize there's something more. And I'm sure as you hear me speak, you will realize there's something more. I will speak about the virtue of moderation under three headings: patience or endurance, the avoidance of extremes, and maybe most importantly, which has also been touched on by several speakers here, self-knowledge and self-reflection. Now, let's get started. 10 minutes into it. I always have very long introductions, but I have very short lectures, so it kind of evens out. My father was a politician, and he would sometimes have to speak during these sorts of functions, and he would say that I'm now going to speak, you are going to listen, I hope you won't finish before me. So we'll see if we can synchronize. Okay, moderation, by which I am thinking philosophically about the Greek sophrosina and the Latin temperantia, is a character trait or virtue often associated with patience or endurance, the willingness to wait and the ability to take the time needed. Indeed, the root of temperantia is tempus, time. In some military settings, patience is indeed a significant virtue. Two good friends of mine in Norway, the military chaplains Bård Mæland and Per Otto Brunstad, wrote a great book some years ago on military boredom. Waiting. Nothing is happening. Remaining vigilant, but it's still boring. And I think that is an excellent example of when patience is needed. In others, it would seem that it is not, due to the necessity of making quick decisions under pressure. And we have heard several stories of that kind during this conference as well. I remember during my own military training, I never got further than junior lieutenant, but I like that because in Norway that's called a fenrik, and that makes me Fenrik Henrik, so that kind of makes it more fun anyway. I remember we were training with some kind of anti-tank weapon, M72 or something. It was really just a plastic tube, so we pretended that was it. And our lieutenant said that there was a tank coming at us from the other side of the valley, and there were our own soldiers down in the valley between us and the tank. And the question was, what do you do? And I think the answer was meant to be of a mathematical kind, the angle. But one of my good soldier colleagues said, well, Lieutenant, then we have to initiate moral reflection. And he said, you have 15 seconds. You don't have time for moral reflection. And we all know that both of them are right. But the moral reflection has to happen earlier, and it has to happen with patience. Now, it may seem like the most trivial of observations, but it surely is not. Most things do take time, even though we are sometimes faced with crises and the need for quick responses. In the larger picture, we know that immediate gratification is not always available. Once again, a weird thing to say at lunch. What hurts, for instance, can go on hurting for a long time. Only when we learn that endurance can get us through, and that we even grow stronger in the process, or at least that we can maintain our better selves by not succumbing to temptation, or by admitting that time might actually heal some wounds, or teach us to live with them, do we also grow more balanced and self-assured. The two names associated with this very conference, Admiral Stockdale and Senator McCain, are testaments to exactly that. The philosopher and political historian Erik Vogelin speaks of the metaxy, the in-between, as the most appropriate symbol for grasping the human condition. And this is certainly relevant to our theme here. The term and concept as used by Vogelin is found in Plato's Dialogue the Symposium. And it conveys the idea, or rather the experience, Vogelin would say, that to be a human being is to be in the in-between, always. In between the unchanging world of eternal principle and the always changing, never fixed world of material change and inconstancy. Human beings, says Vogelin, participate in both poles of this tension. and the desire to escape this tension by either pretending to become God or by simply resigning to the complete relativity and inconstancy of this material world, summarizes the gravest dangers that humans can encounter. He wrote this, of course, in the shadow of National Socialism and communism. We recognize this way of reasoning from many other thought traditions as well. Of course, from Stoicism or from Cicero, from Augustine's warnings against the libido dominandi, to Buddhist or Confucian calls for balance and harmony. Patience constitutes the very essence of living in the world of the in-between. Instant gratification and perfect solutions are not available, yet aiming for a better world and a better life guided by moral principle is not only possible, but necessary, even if it is never fully attainable in this world. What is the relevance of patience or endurance for the military? Well, there are some obvious points of contact and relevance, as pointed out when I mentioned the dangers of boredom. Important, obviously, is also the willingness to take upon oneself pain and hardship. But maybe there is also a special relevance when it comes to moral injury or moral damage. The knowledge that you did not do what you could have done, or you were hindered from performing in the way in which you would, morally speaking, wanted to perform, is often a central part of moral injury as we speak of it here today. And carrying such a sense of shame and even self-loathing, as we've talked about this morning, can be devastating to a human being. But it can, of course, also be seen as a sign of moral sensitivity, even moral greatness, namely that one is capable of taking in the suffering of others, and humbly to see oneself as someone who could have done more. This lies at the heart of moral learning and building of character. Seeing the fact of moral injury not so much as an aberration or a mental illness, as a process through which one processes one's own moral imperfections and gradually grows to accept the past, embrace the possibility of grace and forgiveness, and struggle to integrate the lessons learned into one's view of the future, is dependent upon moral patience or endurance, because it does take time. I heard recently a story about a surgeon who was going to perform a very difficult operation. The patient is clearly very distressed. So the doctor says, well, I performed this operation more than 100 times before. And the patient says, oh, thank goodness. And the doctor replies, well, I have to get it right sometime. Voglin's concept of the medicacy is also relevant to a second, possibly the most obvious meaning of moderation, namely the avoidance of extremes, including the extremes of both emotion, opinion, and action. Aristotle's concept of the golden mean is probably the most famous example of that. Although, interestingly, Aristotle struggles with showing what kind of a mean sophrosyne itself is. What kind of a mean is moderation? Aristotle's main point is that the mean of excellence can in most cases be decided by contrasting it to extremes on either side. All of you know this well. Courage, for instance, can be seen as the mean between foolhardiness and cowardice. The problem is, however, that very few would refer to themselves, or their own actions, or their preferred behavior at least, as extreme. The word is normally applied negatively by outsiders or critics to the persons or actions so labeled. I guess part of moral injury is exactly when we see and realize that what we did was not that as it should have been. And while moderate can similarly be used as a term of derogation, for instance about someone too willing to compromise, it is to a much larger extent a term that is used approvingly and in self-description. Benjamin Franklin famously said, or actually I recently found out he didn't say it. Isn't that really tough when you realize that all these quotes you have been attributing to people, they didn't say it after all? But he's supposed to have said that he was an extreme moderate, thereby calling our attention to the tension between political prudence and moderation on the one side and extremism on the other. On the other hand, many would, even if they are of a different ideological or political persuasion, agree with Barry Goldwater's famous term from his acceptance speech in 1964 at the Republican Party convention, that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. If extremism is understood as principled steadfastness on behalf of a worthy cause, not least a cause that is under attack, We can think of many kinds of extremism that are laudable. So, my friends, how on earth are we to distinguish between the two? I think that is one of the real puzzles of the virtue of moderation. How are we to find the kind of moderation that is laudable rather than cowardly? Erik Vogelin identified late classical versions of Gnosticism, or Gnosticism. I remember I was at a conference with a Vogelin scholar, and they didn't know the term from before, and everyone thought they talked about Gnosticism, something nasty. So they got the point. But it took several years before they realized it was actually Gnostic, the ancient and early Christian religious movement, not a Christian religious movement at the same time. Gnosticism is an early prototype of serious spiritual revolt against the metaxy, against healthy moderation, says Vogelin, and we meet similar revolts in a more politically unequivocal form in our time, not least in totalitarian ideologies. Erik Vogelin's concept of immanentizing the eschaton, have you heard about that? That's a pretty good, actually some of these Vogelin scholars have t-shirts that says, don't let them immanentize the eschaton. It hasn't quite caught on as a bumper sticker yet. But what does that mean? It's really, if you think about it, and there are many theologians here, and you will realize what this means. Because that is the idea that you can conceptualize an end state, a paradise, or eschaton, that you want to realize in this world, imminently, through a radical political program. And then, you can tell people that I can lead you to paradise. Vogelin helps us see how tempting and intriguing such an immanentization can appear. And to use more youthful language from Big Bang Theory, how utterly uncool it can be to be moderate. Since promising in this world what is perfect and beyond, making it possible here and now, represents a seeming opportunity to get rid of everything one does not like, and everything that is watered down, in exchange for what is unadulteratedly good. Against this historical and philosophical background, and normatively speaking, what can we do to get a reasonable grasp of the characteristics of the kind of extremism that is clearly dangerous and pathological? And how can we tell such extremism apart from that deep-seated and principled faith which is willing to fight for worthy causes? Let me suggest 2 points. Firstly, a denial of the in-between structure of reality arguably lies at the core of the most dangerous forms of extremism. Such denial inspires a steadfast refusal to engage in any substantial dialogue about one's own aims or policies. It makes no room for internal criticism or doubt or listening to the other. It rejects openness to what Vogelin called the equivalences of symbolization, by which he means an openness to explorations of how one's own religious or dogmatic symbolism might be parallel to, or based on experiences similar to those of others, even those of one's avowed enemies. The understanding of human existence as metaxic, in between, is strikingly different from pure relativism, we should note. Because this understanding I'm talking about now is fully open to the truth of experiences of transcendence and spirituality. Yet for that very reason, it is also always critical of strongly dogmatic assertions that prioritize the assertions and the dogma as such over the underlying experience that engendered the dogma and the inherent openness of such experiences. That leads me to my second point. The acknowledgement of the basic inherent human dignity of all members of humanity should accompany any movement whose rationale or activism can be characterized as healthy. When particular human beings, qua individuals or groups, lose their value and therefore their most basic rights due to their national or ethnic belonging, religious faith, skin color, or any other trait as a key part of a person's belonging and identity, we are faced with arbitrary discrimination and dehumanization, and thus the danger of tyranny. The essence of moderation in this context must be never to let the heat of the moment allow us to deny the inherent human dignity of the individual, even the wrongdoer. For our topic of today, moral injury, we might at least say that an opening to a spiritual horizon of forgiveness and grace, and a realization that human action in this world can never be perfect, and that one must not fix an unrealistic purity as the standard against which one judges oneself, would be crucial elements of a sort of moderation or temperance that can be of real value in confronting the personal and institutional crisis of moral injury or damage. Dedication, honor, with or without the U, and pride are all admirable qualities. And striving to perform according to the highest values of one's profession, morally and professionally, is key to the high-minded performance of any worthy task. But that must be balanced against the realities of human existence in very difficult situations, taking place in historically contingent and complex settings, where human dignity, including one's own, should be one's lodestar, not impossible perfection. And this leads me to my very final point on self-knowledge. In Plato's famous dialogue on moderation, the Charmides, Socrates and his interlocutors, as so often happens in these shorter dialogues, reach no absolute or unequivocal conclusion as to what moderation is. However, they do coalesce more or less around a key idea, which is closely related to Socrates' Delphic quest. In other words, his quest to discover how it can be that the Delphic oracle speaks of Socrates as the wisest of all Athenians. How can I be when I know so little? And as all of you know very well, the answer, arrived at through an almost lifelong process of philosophical dialectics, is Socrates' knowledge of his own limitations, his ability to know that he does not know. Know thesiauton, know thyself, says the inscription in Delphi. And this is indeed the core theme of the Charmides. The main character, Charmides, he's a funny guy because he's so proud of his sophrosina. He says, I have a lot of sophrosina, which makes him almost like the guy I heard about who was going to do a self-evaluation, giving himself grades from 1 to 10, 1 being lowest, 10 being best, in order to grade himself as to his ability to live up to a list of admirable traits or virtues. One of the virtues listed was modesty, the ability to not to brag. And he was wondering, what should I write? 0, I'm not modest at all. Or 10, I'm extremely modest. He ended up putting down a 5. Self-knowledge, self-reflection, admitting one's limits, accepting them, even when challenging them, and acknowledging that human interaction will always be interaction between imperfect beings, speaks directly not to the weakness of human beings, but to their strength, as beings whose conscious limitations also make it possible to at their best transcend those limitations, and also to be full participants in a society full of such beings. I believe that in an age of artificial intelligence and increasingly autonomous weapons, this reminds us of one of our most crucial tasks as we start to employ these, namely to ensure that such automation using increasingly self-learning machines with far superior computation and executing abilities than we human beings will ever have, that they do not remove that which human beings are truly good at, that they don't make us less. And what are we truly good at? Well, according to Socrates, it is showing moderation in terms of patience, self-knowledge, acknowledgement of one's limitations. Socratic dialectics coalesce around the idea that such self-knowledge can be obtained only through dialogue with oneself and with one's partners. That's why we're here. And it's a wonderful dialogue to be part of. A process of addressing moral injury must always take place in a process of dialogic openness, with the full realization of each individual's human dignity as the aim and goal. When we face the immense tragedies of post-traumatic suicides that have been talked about here today by people who have faced them up close, we are reminded not only that this can happen even when there is a community there to help those struggling. There is no easy fix. But we are also reminded that restoring faith in oneself and one's own value and dignity as an imperfect human being must be the key task we have vis-a-vis each other as fellow human beings. Only when we accept who we are, learn to resign ourselves to the past, build new goals for the future, and see ourselves not only as a sum total of our worst defeats and failures, but also as unique carriers of inherent dignity, as it says in the first line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Can we also build the kind of positive and constructive self-knowledge that lies between the morally lax and the morally impossible? I conclude that patience, the fight to avoid extremes, whether in politics or in personality and character building, and the quest for a balanced and more open self-knowing created in a sphere of dialogue and an atmosphere of togetherness are key features of a modern military that protects its dignity and that of its members. And now, having visited the Naval Academy 6 times through the years, the last 4 times thanks to Ed's kind invitation, I feel this is such a place. I just wrote an email home to Greg Reichberg yesterday and said after the reception, goodness, how nice military ethics people are. But it's true. I think we together feel a sense of moral responsibility to meet these challenges, not least meet and help those who are truly downtrodden. I'll end with a little story, which is not a naval story. It's an air story, but I'll do it in honor of my good friend Jim Cook from the Air Force Academy. And it's about this way in which we often feel that we become so constrained. Isn't that part of the self-encountering moral injury? How can I get out of this? How can I ever love myself again? And it's a funny story about a pilot landing at an airport. And it's a very trained pilot, but she's never landed at this airport before. And she's been told that the runway is extremely short. Extremely short. Short as you can imagine. So you have to land with minimum speed, right at the edge, and you have to brake with everything you have. Flaps and wheels and engines, everything. She's really nervous, sweat is running, coming in, bang, lands. And stops almost immediately. And she says, goodness, that was a short runway. And the other pilot next to her looks to each side and says, and goodness, it's wide. Maybe sometimes we just see the short side. Maybe moral philosophy can help us see more. I thank you humbly for your attention. Thank you. And right now, Ed wanted me to tell you that we should start our break. If anyone would like to comment on something I've said, or expand on things, or protest if you disagree, I would be happy to hear from you. So just raise your hand. Yes, please. Should we have the microphone? No, we'll do it this way.
Right back to you. Yeah, thank you.
My question has to do with how did we lose the dialogue about moral responsibility? How have we lost sight of this, and what do we need to do to restore that?
Well, it's a big question because it's obviously a historical question about something that has happened in our culture. It could be seen as a question with which one does not agree, in the sense that maybe the premises are wrong. Maybe we didn't lose that sort of dialogue. Maybe it's still there, but it's hidden somehow. From my studies of cultural development in the West, I would say the main problem is that we have so many dialogues going on at the same time. So it's hard to know which one is important. There was an excellent presentation here on the core curricula. What should we teach? But as all teachers here know, one of the main challenges is that there is so much to teach. And then we as teachers are hoping there are some things stuck afterwards, namely the most important. But we're not sure about that, because to many it becomes sort of, to borrow a term from my neighboring country, Sweden, smörgåsbord. They have 2 contributions to the international language, smörgåsbord and ombudsman. Norway has Quisling and Fjord. Swedes are better off. Seriously, there are so many things going on at the same time. And as a father of 4 and trying to accompany them through primary and secondary education, high school, I realized that there is so much going on at the same time. So when I believe that what they really carry with them is Plato and Ibsen and basic mathematics, it turns out that to them, this is part of some huge vortex of all kinds of things. And there was Ibsen, but there was Johnson too, and I can't remember who is more important. And then it somehow all falls to the ground. And I think that's a pedagogical task that we have, to remind ourselves and those around us, this is an important dialogue. The others are important too, but this is existential, if we might use such a loaded term. But thanks, it's a great and difficult question. Yes, please, Ed.
You mentioned this perfectionism as a possible source of moral injury, at least excessive guilt. And do you see difference in this kind of attitude between the services? between the different countries' services?
That's a fantastic question. The question is, do we see differences in this sort of perfectionism coming in the way of a healthy view of yourself and being open to, for instance, dialoguing about moral injury? This is not just a topic for the military. Just think about the medical professions. How hard it is for a doctor to admit that I did something wrong because you want to maintain your status with yourself and your colleagues. And what kind of differences do we see? Well, I think there are so many people who are competent to indicate whether there are differences between the branches of the armed forces, whether airmen and women are closer to the sky. These things can sometimes be speculative. Whether there are sorts of challenges that, for instance, an infantryman and woman meets that others do not because you're farther away. And there used to be a theory some 10 years ago that with increasingly automated weapons that we actually guide from afar, you will have less of this because you'll be further away from the battlefield. But of course, as many of you know today, you are actually much closer because you have high resolution camera instead of sitting way above 15,000 feet and not seen. So it turns out that those distinctions are hard to draw too. But I would just throw out at least a question back to your excellent question. Namely, are there differences between Christian denominations? Are there differences between religions? Are there differences between countries? Are certain traditions more used to speaking of sin, for instance? Not negatively, but as a positive statement of who we are, and we have to admit that. You know, I come from a Lutheran tradition, and they say that we take the blame for everything. Because we're sure that we're absolutely, we and Adam, we better share the whole guilt. You know the definition of a Lutheran? It's someone who sings stand up for Jesus sitting down. But seriously, and of course, this is work that has actually been done by sociologists of religion. But I think it's an interesting one to address to you, because here we have many chaplains, and you come from different denominational backgrounds. How can you learn from each other's traditions about exactly this? And maybe where those that are more conscious of the dangers of perfectionism also have a language for addressing that maybe others lack. And I think that's a real question to be asked. Thank you. Okay, there's one more hat. Please, read.
Sure. So, Professor, since you opened the door to commentary, I'm going to take a leaf out of Midshipman Dodd's book and just talk about a work of literature that addresses the question that just came up about different services. And the book, The King Mutiny, depicts the downfall of Captain Queeg and the rather hapless Captain Queeg, who was the subject of the mutiny. And one of the reasons why Queeg has his downfall is that he will not admit to error. There are times early in his command when he has the chance to admit to minor errors and to improve himself, and he refuses to admit to his superiors or to himself that this is the case. And you get the impression that his military service, which begins here at the Naval Academy, and has been going on for now for about 10, 15 years, he's been rubbed raw by a succession of superiors who have questioned his decisions, who constantly checked up on him, who demanded an unreasonable standard of perfection from him, to the point where he's closed up and he's learned his lesson. Okay, just don't admit any mistakes whatsoever, and this is how to get by in the Navy. And it's one of the things that I think leads to his crew mutiny against him, his downfall as a commander. So I don't know if you've read the book or if you have an answer for that.
I think it's a great reference. It's one of those where I'm ashamed, but I can say I've seen the film. So I know very well the reference, and I should read the book. And I think it's a wonderful place to end, because it's once again about self-knowledge, because he is in essence denied self-knowledge. He's denied the space for looking into himself and asking the relevant questions. And then suddenly one day it's too late, because too much is at stake to start admitting errors now. I did reference some of these shorter Socratic dialogues of Plato. As many of you know, they often end in the vein of, we have to talk more about this tomorrow. So I'll say that too. We have to talk more about this tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you.